Okay, so let's dip into today's project. I have another snowman, but I wanted to do this first so that you have a little variety and not just doing the same old things. Create a little more interest. And my apologies for my lack of focus yesterday. I've had a dog that's been sick and back and forth to the vet all the way over Thanksgiving, and I was really worried about her last night, and so my focus was just not there when I was preparing the videos and uploading everything, or finishing them. I've been working on them for days, but I was just finishing it up last night, and I just was not really very focused. And I think that was sort of evident today. Unfortunately, that was on day one, so hopefully you are back on here and giving me another chance. One of the things that I wanted to go over, came up in Zoom, was the brushes that are easiest to wet down the paper with. I don't know if you noticed, I've used these two different ones. This one is actually the easiest. It is a flat brush with a rounded edge, although a completely flat one would certainly work as well, but I wasn't sure if the set that you guys got, the one that I had on Amazon, had one this big. This is a 1/2 inch flat with square edges. And so I've been trying to use the same things that you guys have in your set that I put in the Amazon and Jerry's carts so that we sort of have similar things. It's hard to do it exactly simply because some of you already have paintbrushes from doing other things, and the sets from Jerry's to Amazon to Walmart to whatever else, they're all different. So but basically I'm trying to stay within the guidelines of approximately what I think you folks are going to have, particularly the beginners that may not have a whole set of fancy brushes. If I was doing this on my own, I would use my big brush. This is a 1 inch, and it's great for wetting this thing down really fast, but I'm pretty sure your set doesn't have one, and so I haven't done that. I've tried to use what you have so that when you follow along, it sort of makes more sense. Another question was about the trays. If you try to, there is a video that shows you how to set up your colors the same as mine, so that if you see me, even if I don't say it, if you see me dipping into something, you'll know what it is, because you set your tray up the same as mine. Now, some of you may have different colors than I do. If you already had a set and didn't have to buy a watercolor set, we use these Marie's because it's a great student watercolor set. It's not terribly expensive. So if you decide, hey, this isn't for me, I don't think I want to do this again, then you haven't spent a fortune on a fancy set. And I didn't want anybody to have to spend a boatload of money if they were beginners on really good paints. I obviously have a whole different set because I've got to do things that are worthy of shows and museums and whatnot. So but I'm not using those. I'm using the same ones, the Marie's set. And if you have different ones, for example, you would not need to mix your, over here where I've mixed in a couple of the videos, you hear me talking about putting ultramarine with black in order to create a Payne's gray or a nice gray. If you have Payne's gray, by all means, use the Payne's gray. Sorry, my phone's telling me to go take the trash out. Hey, this is the same thing as live, okay? So life goes on, right? I will turn that down real quick. But if you have Payne's gray, use that. If you have different blues, for example, like Antwerp, or what's one of my other favorite blues? I got my tray right next to me here. Let's see here. Indigo. Oh, indigo is a wonderful blue. So if you have all those things, you can certainly use those colors instead of these. But if you're new at this, I was trying to make this friendly to both beginners and experienced. And if you are experienced, then you know which colors you can use, and you can use your existing colors. Now, today we are going to do, this is a card I made up a couple of years ago, and I sent out to a family member, and they really liked it. And so we're going to do this today. And it has some snow, it has a little cabin, and the only thing we're going to draw is the cabin, because everything else can change. And basically, I didn't pre-draw this for you because it's a, what is that called? You've got a triangle and rectangles, basically, is what makes this. So, I'll walk you through it here. But that's all. The only thing we're going to draw is this little guy right here. And if you can tell from this sheet of paper, this little guy is, if I get that reflection off of there, he is about maybe 2/3 of the way down and about 1/3 of the way over. So that's about what you want. When you're trying to make a painting, you want to have a little bit of interest in different places. So the big tree over here is an interest point, and then the pretty sky is an interest point, and then your little house with the smoke coming out of it is an interest point. But I usually don't put the interest point right in the middle, because ideally you want to have people's eye kind of moving around. So we're going to draw that little guy right there. And I'm going to get a pencil. And essentially, I'm going to do the same thing I did. If that was 1/3, then this is about 2/3 down, and then about 1/3 over. So we're going to draw a rectangle right here, not very big, because we want him to look like he's in the distance, okay? And then right next to him, a line going up at an angle, and the angle doesn't really matter that much as long as this and this line are parallel. As long as those two lines are parallel, it's going to look right. You can draw a little door on there. And then we're going to put a roof on him. And the same angle, we're going to follow the same angle over here. And then a line across the top. Chimney is going to be down on this end. That's where the living room is. And that's pretty much all there is to drawing this. My angle is a little bit high on that house. So we're coming, and then about like that. That's better. That looks much more real. Okay. So it's going up just a little bit, not quite as much as I originally did. You can put a couple windows on here, which is just 2 more little squares. They don't have to be perfect. Remember, they are way out in the distance. So essentially, it doesn't, as long as people can kind of tell, oh, that's a little house in the distance, that's all you need. And the roof is going to have snow on it, so I don't want it to be too dark, and I don't want to have lines in the middle of it. So I'm getting rid of that little line that I left there, because that might show through on my snow later. Okay, that's all the drawing that we're going to do on this one. I hope it looks like you can see that all right on your recording. So I'm going to take the either flat or round, approximately 1/2 inch if you have one. If not, just grab the biggest brush you have that's going to hold the most water, so we can wet this down as quickly as possible. And we're going to start wetting the background. Remember, when you do write on your paper with a pencil, if you ever need to correct anything, do it before you wet the paper, because once that paper is wet, those pencil lines, they don't come off. They don't erase. There's nothing you can do to get those pencil lines off once they get wet. The fibers of the cotton paper, they come up and they sort of envelop it, and it's there to stay. So make your corrections before you wet your paper. Okay, I'm going over the areas where I started, just in case it started drying a little bit on me. So once I have all the water in here, I'm just moving it around a little bit to make sure that we're staying wet. I pre-sprayed my tray so that my paints would be working with me. And I think I used a lot of cerulean in this one, so I'm just going to mix a little cerulean right there. I already have a little violet mixed. And I'm going to mix a little ultramarine in the tray. I know I had a little cerulean on my brush, but that's okay. Let's bring our ultramarine down here because we'll use it for our grays anyway. So on this one, if you watch the cloud making one, if you do different shapes with your clouds, you create a really interesting sky. And I'm not following any particular pattern. I'm just sort of letting my hands move around, and I'm putting cerulean in some places, putting blue in other places. I don't want to really leave a bunch of white just because I'm going to go around my little cabin mostly. I'm not coming into the bottom here either because there's snow. We don't want to paint over the snow. We're going to put a little bit of purple in this also, which I did in the first one. I kind of liked the way that looked. And I'm going to create a little bit of gray over here. If you have paints, you can use that. If you have another gray, you can use that. There's a neutral tint that's really cool that I use now also, which is a nice sort of neutral gray. And we're going to add a little bit of darkness into some areas, and that just, as the water flows through it, it will look more natural. And it will make a really cool sky. The trick is to have your paper pre-wet. If your paper isn't pre-wet, this is not going to look anything like mine. And that's okay if that's what you want, but if you're trying to make it look a little bit like this, you've got to have that paper good and wet. Okay, we're going to let the water do its work now because all of this is going to continue blending and moving around. Okay, I'm going to rinse my brush. I keep 2 containers of water. I always have one to wipe my brush first and get most of the paint off, and then I go into a clean one to make sure that it's good and clean, because if you're painting with green and then you decide to go in to do something yellow, then you're going to have some pretty funny looking yellow. I think that green was there already, so you could throw some salt on here if you wanted to make stars. I'm not actually making stars in this sky because it's really more of a dusk, so you really can't see the stars yet. What I have on there that you see is those were snowflakes that I put on later with white, or maybe I lifted them out. I think I demonstrated this yesterday, but if you take like a number 1 brush, you can lift out ever the slightest bit of, that's not a clean brush, that doesn't help. You can lift out little snowflakes. It's a little time consuming, but if you like that particular look, it is a little different than going back and painting dots with white. And so you can experiment with that and see if you like that better than, whoops, that one was too big. Now we're going to have a big star-like thing there. Unless I grab some blue since it's still wet, and I can save that. Okay. Yeah, that's because sometimes I'll have a drop of water. See that right there? When I rinse my brush, if there's a drop of water up here, it'll dribble down while I'm working, and boom, there it is, right on the paper, and I didn't even know it was gone. But see how I'm lifting out the paint? You could do that. But as I say, that's a little time consuming, and it's certainly easier just to come back with a little white, because this is just a postcard, right? For Christmas, we want it to look nice, but it doesn't have to have any particular appearance. And in the snowman yesterday, I showed you how to do the bigger stars by actually putting a little water on. Right here, I'm lifting out, but yesterday what we did is we actually added a little water onto the surface, because we wanted it to look more like, have star shapes. And you can accomplish that if you are putting a little water onto it while it's still somewhat glossy. Not wet shine, but glossy. Right now, this has lost its gloss. So that's a good time to come down here and do our lower tree line. We need a little tree line there. I'm trying to think which brush. I like tree lines with my angled brush, but I don't know if you have one, so I'm not going to use that. But this makes great tree lines by just going like this. Great tree lines. Let's see here. I've got to do it quickly. So I'm just going to grab a round. It looks like it's a number 4. And we're going to get a little bit of this blue. This is in the distance. These trees are way back there. So we're grabbing some sap green and some of our ultramarine just to make some dark. This may already be too dry, but maybe not. I'm going to have to grab a fatter brush because that's dry enough that it is not really looking like a tree line. So this fatter brush, it's a little rounded. You can make a distant tree line while your paper is still a little bit wet. Because you want it to sort of blend into the background. I'm just going to wipe that because we're putting that snow in front of it. Putting a little water down here and just wiping the bottom of that tree line so that it looks like they're sort of fading into the snow. And now with this brush, I'm going to grab a little bit of that mixed color, but I added a little more blue to it. And we're going to do a little slightly larger tree back here. Too wet. Okay. So the way we do a tree, I'll do this one and then we're going to do a quick practice on an extra sheet. But I want you to be able to see. Okay, he's sitting there. Now I'm going to grab a practice sheet. If you have some extra paper or your notebook, let's do a couple of trees. The last class I did this with you already. And if some of you, I know some of you are repeats, so I apologize, but I want to make sure everybody's comfortable with doing a tree. So if you're in the distance and your background is a little bit wet, they blend in and they look like they're farther away. So I'm going to wet that a little bit. You just draw a line, and then you go back and forth with your brush. Usually trying not to be exactly back and forth, because that's not the way trees are, but essentially, he's way back there. Now over here, that's a little bit drier. This guy is a little further forward so you can see more detail on him. I'm just moving my brush back and forth and letting the water actually move the paint for me. I'm just sort of hinting at the direction I want that tree to look, and the water will do the rest of the work for me. This is another thing we'll be doing in this picture is you take that brush while it's still got a little paint in it, and you can put it on its side and create detail shadows in the snow without really much effort. See how that looks? You take a little Payne's gray and put it as a shadow under the tree. If this was closer up, on the further ones you don't get that, but on a closer up one you're going to have some shadows. And if you have a guy that's really close, you want him to be real sharp, so he's over here. And I'm just juggling my brush and sort of somewhat making it meet the last spot. Sometimes he comes out a little bit. Sometimes maybe there's nothing on this side for a couple of branches. And then there's one down here. And remember, they get a little bit wider as you go down, unless they're this other kind of tree. There's another kind of tree that's, I can't remember what it's called. I should look it up. But you draw a very thin line, and his leaves sort of drape down, and he's very narrow. He's always narrow. This is a pine, but his branches are heavy with needles, and they always drape down, and they're always very narrow. And maybe one of you guys knows, but that's a certain kind of pine. You can see them actually as Christmas trees right now. I saw one yesterday. It was very attractive. If you have a tight space, this is a perfect kind of tree for a tight space because they are very narrow. But the branches sort of drape down a bit. And then you add a little bit of shadow into the branches while your green paint is still wet. And that makes it look like there's shadows under some of those branches. See how real that makes that look without much effort. Your eye will finish the detail. If you'll just give it a little bit of detail, your eye will finish the rest. This is still a little damp, so I can still add a little shadow. under some of his branches. I'm not being very specific. I'm just sort of on the bottom half of the branches. I'm putting a little bit of shadow. Okay, so that's how we do different kinds of trees. I hope you saw all of that because I wasn't looking at the camera. Oh my dear. Okay, this is fairly dry now. So I'm going to put one of these little trees that's closer up front because this is not going to fade into the background very much. But he's over here behind the little, right next to actually the little cabin. Too wet. We can add snow to this later, but right now I just want to get them all down. So there's that little guy. And maybe there's another one right next to it up front. Little green and blue mixed together. You can vary the colors. He's just a baby, so he's kind of small. I'm going to put a little bit of shadow in this. He's pretty far back there. You don't have to do very much of that, but just a hair. Okay. Now, let's see here. I think the best brush for this slightly larger tree, this isn't quite dry yet. I'm going to blow dry this, and I recommend you do the same because our next tree is going to look a little bit different, and we're going to need to sprinkle the page with another with a spritz bottle. Remember the spritz bottle that's in your shopping kit? You need something that spritzes very small. A big bottle will make too big of a droplet. So this is the spritz bottle. I'll show you what it's going to do after that dries. I'm going to barely spritz this paper. I can't lay it on there because that's still wet. And test a spritz on my leg. There. I spritz that just a little bit. And what I'm going to do is take a fine number 1. Find my number 1. There was one that flew across the room earlier. I bumped it. I bumped the tip of it and it went flying. I'm not real sure where it is. Well, this is still, you can see the little dots on it. Let me see if you can see that. Yeah, see that? It's not soaked. It's just little dots. And here's what a tree looks like if you do it with that method. I'm going to take some darker. You don't want your paint dripping, but you do want, somewhat wet paint. See, it's not real thick. It's not dripping. We're going to come and draw a quick line. See how the water is making that stem? And we're just going to go back and forth a little bit. This doesn't work for the smaller trees because they're just too small, but it makes a great effect for these front ones. You can do this with a sponge on bigger paintings. Let me show you that little sponge. If you had a bigger painting, I would go get a kitchen sponge and slice a triangle off the end. And this is great for a larger painting where you sprayed that. But we tried to use that with this, and it was a little bit, these postcards, it was a little bit too small. So we're just going back and forth while those droplets are still there. You have to hurry up while the droplets are still there. If you get distracted, you lose the effect of letting these droplets do this really cool tree work for you. I'm just kind of doing this with my pencil. I'm sort of wiggling it around and trying to get some paint near those droplets so that it will carry them. And then you make sure that you can see a little bit of a stem in the middle there so that something's holding that tree together. You can make it wider at the bottom if you want. This all has to be done before these drops dry. If you want it to be really wide at the bottom, you can do that. You can fill it in a little more at the bottom. There you go, and then a shadow below him. There you go. Now, otherwise, he's floating in the air. So that is how we're going to be doing this tree. But the background has to be 100% dry. So I'm going to hit mute, and if you have a hairdryer handy, you'll want to dry yours completely, because even though this is no longer glossy, it's still bowed, which tells me it's wet, and it also feels cool to the touch, which tells me it's wet. So I will see you in a moment, but I'm not going to pause this because I want you to have time to do it as well. Okay, hopefully you didn't hear that hairdryer. So now that this is dry, we are going to spritz this left-hand corner and put in that tree. I'm going to test on my hand. That's the look you want. Not completely full. You can test it on your hand or just test it in the air. I can tell I sprayed a bit much right there. My thing's aimed the wrong direction. I want to make sure I'm aimed right where I want that tree. Okay. Now let's try that. A little bit of this grayish blue, and we'll mix it with a little bit of this green down here. So sort of the darker the better on this particular, the further forward something is, the darker and the brighter the colors are. So I'm going to put a little more green, and a little more black, and a little more blue. A little more than that blue. Ooh, that might be too much. Okay, I like that color. Let's see if my dots are still there. Oh no, dear, they disappeared. Okay, let's try that again and work a little faster. Okay, I'm going to have to dry this again because I had messed up when I put it down. And so when I patted it dry with the paper towel, it's just not quite dry enough to do what we need. Mute. Okay, let's try this a third time. With the paintbrush ready so that I can do it quickly. We are putting our little tree on here, and that was not quite enough spritz. Some papers are more absorbent than others, and you'll find that this is a little harder to do on certain papers because they're just absorbing your water up too fast. But you kind of have to play around with it because every paper manufacturer, they just do it. They all do it a little bit different, and you'll get different effects when you try to do certain things with their paper. One of the students in the class said she had accidentally gotten lighter weight paper, and that definitely makes a difference in how these things work. I'm doing it from a distance, but I'm spritzing it a little more, but I was about 8 or 10 inches above the paper. Watercolor paper has something called sizing on it, which essentially is starch, but I mean, it sounds real fancy, sizing, but it's essentially a covering of starch that is supposed to slow the absorbency of the water into the paper so that you can work with it, and have the colors blend and whatnot. But sometimes they don't have a lot of sizing, certain papers. And sometimes if you pre-wet your sky like we did, and maybe you overwork it a little bit, which I probably did, then you lose some of that sizing. It sort of gets watered down and brushed into the paper. So when you come back to do something like this, it's absorbing too fast. Okay, so that works for him. This next guy, I'm not going to try to use that method because he's a little bit further back, and this didn't really work all that great with my paper. I don't know about yours, but maybe yours looks awesome. But mine was just not cooperating this time. The one that I did on that little card looks a whole lot better. See how sharp and nice its corners are? But this one just isn't doing it. I think I worked that paper a little too much with my sky. But ideally, you don't have to do all this brush work that I'm having to do right now if you can let those droplets of water do the work for you. That was the whole idea, was to try to make this easier for everybody. So it works much better on a larger scale, but on these little cards, it's hard to get those droplets small enough. So there's another little tree. You can put him anywhere you want. I kind of want him right there. And I'm going to try to imitate the look of this next tree next to him somewhat. Remember, we're going to come back with a little bit of snow, so this is going to change the way that this looks a little bit when we add the little caps of snow on the tree. So right now we're just basically trying to make it obvious that there's a tree there. And that's kind of our only purpose at this point, because it'll look better when we put snow on it. You can see where that tree sits back further than this tree. So I'm putting a little darker towards the bottom of this one so that it brings it forward a little bit more, because he is, after all, closer to the front. I'm not going to put shadows under him just yet because I want to put another tree over here while I'm still got this color. You can change the colors. You could put a red tree over here, maybe it's the end of fall and there's like a red tree right over here. Now this is up here, that's a little higher, the cabin's right here. I want this tree to be a little further down in the front so that I've got a little variety. I'm going to try that spritz one more time. See what happens if I'm about 6 or 7 inches above the paper. See if it cooperates with me. Not particularly. We're going to go ahead and go in front of that house. Well, I did anyway. In front of that little house a little bit. I'm going to cover the top because I don't want it any wetter. I'm going to spritz the bottom because I'm bringing him forward a little bit more to have a little bit of variety in our picture there. the levels. You want the levels. When I say variety, I'm talking about levels. And that's one of the things that draws it around. If I had all the trees at the same height right here, with all flat snow up front and all sky above, it wouldn't really draw your eye around. It wouldn't look very natural. I'm even going to bring this guy just a little bit further down, because I think that he needs to be a hair further. We'll pretend that he's going off the page over here. Okay. When we put the snow on him, he'll look better. Trust me. Okay. A little bit of the black. A little bit more of this green. Looks like I need to reload green. A little bit of our ultramarine. This guy's a little bit light for being this far forward, so I'm adding a little bit of darker color to him. Further forward, the more I'm going to dab right here where it got a little too wet. Just going to dab that just a hair to sort of control that from flowing all over, because it will follow the water, and I just don't want it moving quite that much. Okay, a little more green. If you do this while it's still wet is when it works best, because your darker colors are mixing with the lighter colors that are there. And whereas in oils and acrylics and pretty much every other medium, you go from dark to light because you add your highlights at the end. In watercolors, you kind of start with the highlights and you're adding your shadows. So it's best done, as a general rule, unless you're wanting very sharp edges on purpose, adding your shadows is done while your paint is still wet. Sorry, I brought my tray. It moved. Okay. Let's see if we can move that light a little bit. I'm going to do a close-up on this guy. Oh, that's better. Okay. I'm going to do a close-up here. See if we can move that. Okay, see him? Zoom in a little more. Okay. You can kind of see how it looks. Okay, going back to the scene. There we go. Okay. Still learning all my equipment, as you can probably figure out by watching me sort of struggle with it. But that's why there was such a good price for this. You know, you get 1-hour lessons, which are usually $25 to $35 an hour. And you get it all for $20 because I am sort of working through all of this, and it allows me an opportunity to practice. So you get to learn at a good price, and I get to practice and sort of have my students be patient with me because they got a good deal. So that is the method to my madness. Now we're going to work on this little house next. So I'm going to grab a slightly larger brush. I think he's at number 2. So I don't need a super sharp point. He's a funny shaped one, but as I said, my other one went flying across the room earlier, and I haven't found it yet. So we're going to grab a little bit of this burnt sienna. Now he's kind of in the background, so it doesn't have to be real dark. But you're just going to put a little paint on him, and I'm going to wet that a little bit. That's a little too wet. Okay. But you want him to look like he's kind of way back there. And let's say it's it can be anything you want, but I'm sort of making him a log cabin. So I am going to put a little more paint on my brush so that it's a little more concentrated, and sort of move my brush horizontally I'm not worried about the windows because I can go over the windows with black. If this was a dark night, you would be going over the windows with white because the lights were inside. But in this case, we'll probably go over the windows with black. So see how that gives a little bit of a hint that it's logs. And then if you take your ultramarine, which is a great shadow color, you want to come under the roof. That is not the right brush for this. You can come under the roof and put a line under there. I'm going to actually mix a little of this burnt sienna with my ultramarine. And it also makes a nice gray. It's more of a cool, warm gray. Now let's see here. Warm means it leans towards red. Cool means it leans towards blues. So that's what that means if you hear me saying it's warm or cool. This is just the shadow under the eaves where the snow is. Now I'm going to rinse a little bit of that off because I know it's pretty dark. I don't want this very wet, but I'm going to hint at those lines again. Just want like sort of an idea that there's some lines. And it doesn't have to be perfectly all the way across because remember this is at a distance. Okay, we're going to let that dry before we try to put our little windows in. You can add more shadows later also, but essentially you just want to get the main colors on here so that you could tell what is back here. I'm back into my burnt sienna in case you didn't notice. So it's sort of mixing a little bit with that ultramarine that I put on there, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, I just wanted it, when I looked at the image, I thought I want that just a little bit browner. He's sort of hiding back there a little bit behind this tree, and I think we can work on our snow now up front. We're going to want to use some of the same colors that we used in the sky. And we're going to dampen our front bottom half. Don't get into your tree. We don't want this soaking wet. We just want it a little bit damp. So move that brush around a lot so that it's not super wet, because we don't want what we do here to flow too much. Now I'm going to use this same round brush. It could be a slightly smaller one. It just happens to be what I have in my hand. And I'm going to grab a little bit of that purple color that we used in the sky. See how it's right here? So let's say there's a little reflection of that in the snow down here. And then over here there's a little bit of purple, so he's going to reflect right there. I'm not filling it in too much. I'm grabbing a little more of this sky color that I had up there, up top. And I'm going to lay my brush on its side and just sort of move it around a little bit. This doesn't have to be, it's not an exact science. You're just trying to leave some whites, but create some shadows. Then you can grab a little bit more of that darker color that was in our sky, and you can tuck them inside the blue here. And that will sort of make it like there's a dip in the snow. It's also a great color for shadow under the trees. If you don't put a shadow under your trees, they will look like they're floating in mid-air. So the shadow around the trees is very important. Grounds them, I guess is the word. Now our shadow on this back one needs to be lighter, so I'm going to get my brush a little bit wetter. I want the shadow there, but I don't need it to be as dark because it's further back. I have too much water on there, so soaking it up with my brush. Maybe the narrower brush would be better for those far shadows. Well, now it's too wet. There we go. Just a little something underneath to bring it down. Needs to be darker as it's closest right under the tree. So while it's still wet, you can do that. You don't have to be this specific or this detailed, I guess is the word on yours. That's just who I am. A little bit of a perfectionist. So if I'm getting into way too much detail, you know, you can stop at any time. I'll tell you what, loose paintings are it. They are hot right now. And that means that there's not quite as much detail in them, but people like that. So that's cool. I want to add a little color to my trees back here. I don't like that they're quite so dull and dim and all the same color, so I am going to add maybe a little bit of violet in there. I just think they look a little boring. Let's just add a little bit of color to that landscape. If you wanted to do a different kind of tree, you could put it up behind the cabin. Maybe there's a big old maple or something back there. I didn't do this on the original, but if you wanted to, you could pretty much add anything you want. You could do 10 of these and not one of them would look the same as the other. It's a neat thing about doing this kind of quick postcards is you can get an idea and say, oh, I want to do that. And they will all just look different and special. I'm putting, if you want to hint at a tree, but you don't need to be, won't want to be too specific, I will show you how to do that. You can make a stem and maybe it's straight, maybe it's not. This one's going to be a little crooked. I turned my phone down, but somebody is really trying to get me. Okay. You add branches coming off of it. They need to be a little bit narrower where they come off. You never want them directly across from each other. Kind of zigzag them. And then you come up off of that. And then come up off of that. It doesn't have to have a lot. If you do 2 on each one, it will look like a tree. You're just hinting here. So that's how you can kind of give the hint of a tree without going into great detail. So you could be as detailed as you wanted with your little landscape back here by adding just simple little details like that little tree. And he looks a little funny with just one, so we're going to put another one right here. Just hinting that there's some woods back here. No big deal, just sort of hinting that there's something besides pine trees in the neighborhood. Okay, I'm happy with that. Now we're going to put a little path coming out from the house. Maybe a little walkway with some shadows. Same shadows from our sky. Just sort of coming out and just sort of walking through the snow. That phone just does not want to get turned off. I don't know what it is with my phone today, but boy, it is determined no matter how many times I turn it down that it is going to talk to me. That just looks like some little guy was walking down from the house. Now a little bit of shadow in front of the house with our gray. Just sort of ground it a bit. And we'll take some black and put in a door. That's not a pointy enough brush for that little thing. So grab your tiniest brush. This I think is a 0 actually. But I've worn the numbers off, so I couldn't swear to that. Put a little window here. And a little window right there. Looks like a cabin, doesn't it? Okay. So his chimney should probably be really dark brown. There we go. And you just have to hint at that. It doesn't have to be, super detailed. Now, of course, I'm going to overkill and put a shadow on everything. But you don't have to do that. That's just me. It's the way I roll. Okay. I'm fairly content with that. I think I want snow on this, though. And I'm going to do that with my small brush and white, which has dried on me, which is normally fine, but I don't want to spend 5 minutes trying to re-soften that white. So I'm actually just going to put a little more in here because it's easier and quicker. Y'all don't have to sit here waiting on me to mix all that white. Which was my snowflake brush. It's the one that I sent across the room. That was the best one for snowflakes. Let's try. No, that's too narrow. There it is. I found it. Okay, I'm grabbing a little bit of snow. First of all, I'm going to go on top of this cabin because he's got some snow right up there on his roof. And you want to leave some of that blue that we had from the sky because that's the shadow of, on the snow. It's the shadow. I'm going to put a little snow on this side. There we go. Just a line. A little bit of a line there, that's all. Now, my snow is going to be a little wet for this. So see how I'm wetting it in the tray? I'm grabbing the white and I'm wetting it so that it won't be stark white. Because the snow on the back trees cannot be stark white. You want it to sort of lighten as it dries. And I'm just sort of moving this around back and forth. When it dries, a little bit of that green from below is going to come up into it and it will lighten it. Because I watered it down a little bit. If you don't want it to do that, then you don't water it down. Just going back and forth, sort of on top of those little branches that we had. On these back ones, I'm going to lay it on his side and sort of just hint at snow on them because we can't really see the shapes of those trees. We just know they're back there. So we're just going to sort of back and forth, just sort of hint that there's some snow on those, whatever they are. Now back to our more concentrated white for these little guys up front. Yours can be as little detailed or as more detailed like mine, however you want. The whole point is to make it an original by you. And the neat thing about these cards is let's say that you do one that you really, really like, and you don't think you can do another one that good, or you try several and none of them look that good, take that one. You can photograph it with your camera, make sure it's on the highest setting. As far as, like if it's a 12 megapixel camera on your phone or on your regular camera, whichever. If it's 12 megapixel, make sure it's all the way on 12 megapixels because you need it to be dot per inch is what the printers look for. You need those concentrated dots per inch. So you put it on its highest, largest image setting. And then you photograph it in good daylight. You can do it At noon outside in the shade is great. You can try a flash, but sometimes that'll leave shadows along the sides, so it's always better outside in daylight, preferably at noon, because the sun will usually sort of have strange shadows when you photograph it. It's interesting. You would think the sun wouldn't do that, but it does. So artists always learn to photograph at noon in the shade, so we get excited about shady days. Overcast days where there's no breaks in the clouds, we get to go photograph artwork. Okay. Sorry you hear my dogs. They get to playing, they get roughhousing, and you can hear them, but let's see here. We'll put some snow on this little guy. I'm just sort of following the tops of the branches. And you put some in the middle because obviously there's branches on the front here. You can't distinguish them, but they are there. We know they're there, right? So you want to put some snow in there. If the snow dries on you and you can't really see it very well, you can do a second layer. That's not a big deal. Just remember, you can go back and do another layer if you need to. Just let this one dry completely first. When we were in a classroom, we didn't have to worry about dog noises. But there again, everybody had to get up and go to school. I used to teach classes at a co-op. We had a lot of kids, and it was a lot of fun teaching that. I've taught classes in my home. I've taught classes in other people's homes, and it's definitely different trying to do this online over a video talking to myself. So hopefully I'm talking enough and not too much. There's probably a happy medium there that I have not discovered yet, but y'all be honest with me on the Zoom and tell me, hey, you're talking too much, or you need to explain more, too much quiet times, which is usually not an issue with me, if you know me. My sister is in this group this week, and she knows there's not a lot of quiet times when I'm around, because I've usually got something to say. Okay, we're going to do this little back guy. And I don't have to be as detailed with him because he's a little further back. I'm just sort of going to hint at some snow along the branches there. And then we'll do our snow dots. You don't want those super thick. As you know, I put that fresh paint there, and so it's somewhat thick. But I do have it ever so slightly watered down so that we can add our snowdrops. Different sizes. Sometimes your hand will bump the paper a little harder than others, and that makes it a larger snowdrop. Remember to put some in front of the trees because the snow, it doesn't look realistic if you don't cover all your items with the snow. And on your shadows down here. Shadows in the snow down here. You could see the snowflakes there. Obviously you can't see them on the white parts, but you should be able to see them on the shadows. So we want to put them everywhere. I'm just moving my hand around the sheet. Hopefully I'm not blocking your view completely. See how those that we watered down faded back? So because it was watered down with white, the color underneath came forward a little bit and it toned down our white. view on top of our front of our cabin. Make sure we got some in front of those trees. Okay, the only other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little smoke. And the best way to do that is to actually remove paint instead of trying to, it's not the right brush for that. Instead of trying to paint white on it for snow, it's easier to remove a little bit of paint. And that's easy to do by just wetting an area and dabbing it with a paper towel. And that's the smoke coming out of the little cabin's chimney. And it's not real obvious because we're just hinting. You know, he's way in the distance. You can just work your brush over that. You're basically scrubbing off the color and then dabbing it off. I see the little smoke coming out of there. I just wet it, scrubbed it, and dabbed it off with my paper towel. And I think we're going to call this one done. And I'm pretty sure that took up the whole class. So we will do the other snowman tomorrow. And if you get on the Zoom, we'll talk about the poinsettia that we're going to do. And I'll try to have that done in 2 different ways for you so that it can be loose or detailed depending on how, you know, we want this to be relaxing and fun for you, not stressful. So I try to give you ways of making it simpler when I can. So I hope you've had fun today. And I will see you in class tomorrow. And hopefully, if you're on here live, I will see you in the Zoom in just a few minutes.